welcome to everyone gathered here online. It's wonderful to have you helping us toward our civil courage goals. We're honored and grateful to have Anna Rosmus as our guest. As many of you know, her work through Michael Verhoeven's film, she insisted on remembering the past despite tough resistance from her present back then in Passau. Similarly, the Rosenstrassel Civil Courage Foundation is a commemoration organization. Our work is rooted in remembering the past, but the point of our commemoration is the present, our today. Patterns of human behavior are evident across time and across societies. We're interested in history in part because we can perceive ourselves in the past and broaden our perspectives. We can see parallels that link our era to that of Hitler and the Germans, for example. That is not to equate Hitler's crimes with those of others, but through vicarious experiences of the past, we shed light on ourselves. So, our purpose, our foundation is to inspire, to educate, to sharpen moral awareness here and now. And our foundation chooses to highlight the stories of rescue, of human goodness. This is not to question the overwhelming darkness of evil. It's not possible to alter the horror of the Holocaust. Defiance was rare, but it stands out brilliantly against the pattern of perpetration and collaboration. We don't want to allow stories of human goodness to get lost. That's one of our main goals. So commemoration allows us to examine our moral choices in light of risk and responsibilities. So let's hear from Anna Rosmus now, how honest memory of the past sheds light on our choices and experiences today. Again, thank you all for tuning in, to joining us here this evening. Thanks to the wonderful persons of our foundation who have made this possible, particularly Sarah Brophy for organizing and conducting this workshop. And thanks as well to others of the board and staff here, in particular, Liam Wierzanski, who I expect to join us soon. Now let's hear from Ms. Anna Rosmus.
Do you have a specific question for me?
Yes, we do. Let's see. We do have a few questions to start off with, and I also wanted to highlight that you've just released a new book. Please excuse my accent. Mein Koffen macht die Tür auf, about the T4 program in Southern Bayern. So I also wanted to spotlight that. So to kind of get us started, I think that Dr. Soltis did a great job of highlighting your work in Passau, and I was wondering what kind of first interested you in the Nazi past, because it doesn't seem like something that the community was very open to receiving.
Well, it was relatively easy in 1980. I had graduated in history with a straight A. I knew a lot about ancient war crimes, about the Persians, about Egyptians and Romans. And yet, Adolf Hitler had lived in Passau, Heinrich Himmler had lived there, Kaltenbrunner had lived there, Eichmann had lived and married there. We had never heard about any of it. So I wondered about that discrepancy. I was curious. And when threats started to pour in, I was determined to figure out why that secrecy is so overwhelming. And almost half a century has passed since. I have found so much that I'm still working on it to this day.
I think that's incredibly interesting because it seems kind of a natural step in the things that you were learning in Passau, in the schools in Passau, and somehow this is just this big overlooked area. And I guess that of course leads to the next question, aside from the love of learning and the moral duty one might feel just in finding out the truth. How were you able to continue even as the threats poured and even as prominent leaders in the community were putting pressure on you to stop? How did you find that courage?
I think it was simply a moral necessity. I figured very quickly when I started to look for facts that there were thousands of victims in my hometown alone, not even counting the tens of thousands surrounding it. There were too many victims, isolated and forced out. They were excluded. In the end, they were eliminated. In the process, subjugated to all kind of horrors. Being silent and knowing those things would have been unacceptable to me. So I learned to go about it two ways, very rational. For one thing, I took to the courts. I sued my hometown. And apparently, I was the first German to do so. I did not want money. I did not sue for information. I simply wanted to see the facts. I wanted to know the history of my hometown. And because I was denied it, which was against the law, I felt one way to gain access to facts is by taking to the courts and request access. I did this, but it took years. 4 years after I started the process, I finally gained access, slowly, to the town's archives in Passau. In the meantime, I learned very quickly to bypass my hometown's refusal to cooperate and to share information. I learned where I find other archives, alternative sources. I located survivors and emigres. I located many American veterans. I collected their memories and I collected their documents. Over 46 years in the meantime, I was piecing them together, weaving strings of those pieces. And 46 years later, I'm still working on it because I keep finding a lot of facts. And hardly a week goes by where not other people, additional people, are turning to me for either help locating information about their own family or sharing information with me. So there is a very intense network in the meantime that's very productive. And in the meantime, my 18th book is almost ready, not counting a lot of academic additional research, additional projects that I have sponsored or where I have contributed to.
I think you make a really good point there as well, that the most effective forms of resistance end up being these group efforts of reaching out to descendants, other people with these memories, and kind of arming ourselves with the broader truth, and bringing people into the fight as well. Can you touch on maybe also the importance of bringing these other um, witnesses and other people interested in the cause in to kind of form this united front that one town can't break, that one court can't break, but a group of people?
For me personally, trust plays an essential part in it. If archives, that is, authorities in multiple countries, in multiple institutions, state, local, private, you name it, would not have been able to trust that I do not violate laws, data protection, for instance, they could not have granted me access, very intense access. For many years, I have access, almost unlimited access, to some of the most secret archives in Europe. I have access to health records, which are among the most guarded files anywhere in the Western world. They have learned they can trust me. I will not violate data protection. I will not get them in trouble for giving me access by overstepping my limits. Trust is also essential for personal memories that survivors share with me and that liberators share with me. Many of those have operated in a deep gray zone, let's put it that way. There were crimes that some of them had to participate in order to survive. There were ordinary people, desk workers, who committed crimes in order to save lives by faking a signature, by stealing passport forms, and so forth. There were resistance fighters supporting partisans, for example. They told me what they did, and yet would I have dared to publish that while they are alive? They would have lost their retirement funds. There are survivors of concentration camps who told me about very delicate issues such as digging up corpses, eating dead bodies, just to survive. Would I have published these things? They would have been social outcasts in their communities. If I was allowed to see prosecution, subjugation, and killing through their eyes, in their observation, I had to keep certain parts, certain aspects to myself, at least for a long time, in order not to embarrass them. That trust was growing as time went by. People, that is not only the first generation, the original perpetrators and victims, but their descendants. In the meantime, the third and even fourth generation read my publication, they heard me speak, they saw projects that I put together on an international scale. They watched what I do with information before very gradually deciding that they too would supply me with additional pieces. That trust takes time to build. It takes a lot of knowledge to realize how far you can go legally and morally without a deep-seated conscience and awareness of what's right and wrong that I have been raised with all my life. I think that would not have been possible. Would I have set out for sensation early on? I could have made a lot of money by publishing some cases in detail. It would have killed the rest of my work, however, because trust would not have existed. Would I have not gone to the absolute limits of what may be still legally possible? I think hardly anybody would have ever read one of my books, one of my essays. It would not have been interesting enough, not juicy enough, as some put it. To keep that balance takes a lot of self-restraint. And I think if we, as society, as older people, I'm now 66 myself, if we can teach younger generations to look for that balance, it does not always rule out mistakes, but it can guide them for projects of their own that schools or other institutions may not teach them. We may be able to share our own experiences, now not as survivors or liberators, but as people who learn from these people what to do with it for the benefit of others, of new issues, of new victims. If we look back at statistics only, it does not move a lot of people. Yes, I can say up to 360,000 people have been forcefully sterilized during the Third Reich. 300,000 patients have been killed in mental institutions. Among them were 5,000 children. That is a horrific number. But there are a lot of numbers worldwide. People will move on to other conflicts, to other areas. If we fail to put faces and personalities to those victims, if we fail to illustrate who these people were, what kind of lives they lost, not just the fact that they did. Much of the information is lost to begin with, but also a larger, broader change for a new generation to empathize with others. If we manage to make these people likable, to give an impression of this child was not just handicapped, it had no legs, for instance, but the child had dreams. The child was a wonderful sibling. The child was a loving child and grandchild. The child did accomplish this or that. Empathy will grow exponentially. People will be sorry for that child that it was killed, just because he could never walk. It is a very simple example, and there are lots of them. To this day, I ask descendants and the few survivors who are still there to tell me stories about the victims, to simply turn them into people. They were given numbers by the Nazis instead of names. They were sent to concentration camps where they had to line up and where they were killed. They were meant to be eradicated. Personally, I have tried for decades to make them visible, to reinsert them into society. I have tried, with some success, to undo what was done. I cannot bring them back to life, of course. But Robert Klein, for instance, a painter in San Francisco, was escorted by the Passau mayor to the train station personally. And personally, he was handed a one-way ticket out of town, out of the country, to Israel. It was a one-way ticket. In 1986, when I traced him, I invited him to come back as guest of honor. Not only that, I made darn certain that the current mayor would personally be at the train station and pick him up and welcome him back. I made sure he picked up his suitcases and carried them for him. It is very small gestures by comparison. Not that much that we can do afterwards, but it worked small wonders for all these people. In 1923, the swastika flag of Adolf Hitler was blessed in the Passau Cathedral. 50 years after the war was over, I made darn sure that the Bishop of Passau welcomed all the Jews, all the emigres, and all the soldiers, the American soldiers, all deemed enemies of the country and unwelcome in the city. He did. And I made darn sure that all these formerly unwelcome enemies of the German people are welcomed by the mayor at Green City Hall. It is small gestures, but it moved all these victims and the liberators to tears at that time. And to the end of their days, they remembered that for the first time ever, they heard a thank you as liberators. They heard an apology as victims. So even if those efforts come very late, if they are very small in nature, to these victims and the liberators, it meant the world. And from that experience, I think it is worth teaching younger generations examples of what they might be able to do for other victims. Possibly speak up before the victims are victimized. But if it already happens, maybe they can step in, start interventions on their behalf, protect the innocent, protect what is morally right, and prevent what is morally wrong. It is worth an effort, I think. It may help other people.
I think you really get to the crux of the issue of here of how do we inspire this next generation? How do we get our message across? How do we put faces and names to these huge concepts that seem overwhelming or too big to begin with? I think your story of kind of righting these wrongs is incredibly powerful, and doing it also because it's the right thing to do and not because there's some sort of accolade or a pat on the back to go with it is important also when we're talking about civil courage is we need to exhibit civil courage. We need to do the right thing by virtue of it being the right thing to do and making those amends. And I think that's what we're trying to do here with the civil courage workshops, as well as putting these faces and names and actions to these nebulous things. So, on kind of that note, before we get into some of the other questions, we ask this of every civil courage workshop speaker. How would you define civil courage? And how do you continue your resistance today, whether it be through academic work, whether it be through personal choices in your life, however that resonates with you?
From my viewpoint, civic courage is an active engagement against injustice. It is the defense of a moral standard, an intervention, usually on behalf of others, and motivated by a strong sense of duty. Often, not always, it occurs in public view. And because that is the case, it often comes at considerable personal risk and expense. Social isolation and stigma is a frequent consequence. Legal consequences may follow. Financial consequences may come in tow. Civic courage can be a spontaneous act, such as physically stepping in when you see somebody is physically attacked. It can be against a verbal insult that you witness, either in the workplace or in the family. It may take some guts to stand up to your superior or a politician and say, enough, this is not acceptable. Civil courage can come in very simple, small steps. It can be a planned action like signing a petition. It can be sharing a link online that is important, setting the facts straight. It can be as simple as joining an event. I, for example, have intentionally joined the May 8th event in Vienna. For decades, in Germany and Austria, May 8th was the symbol of defeat, the end of the Third Reich. It was commemorated by right-wingers, mostly. In Vienna, the Mauthausen Committee has turned it in a festival of joy, celebrating the liberation instead. I think initiatives like that initially required courage. They were unpopular. There were hostilities, sullen hostilities. In the meantime, many years later, it is quite acceptable. The symphony orchestra plays free for everybody. Other musicians come, and we commemorate the liberation of National Socialism and the concentration camps in particular. It can be donating to a project. All these things can be marginal, and yet, in certain circumstances, when authorities are watching, are trying to put you on the spot, it may require civil courage to persevere, to continue. Do it here and there. And if you see young people, as I often do, asking, well, what can I do? I am young. I am just a private person. I don't have money or power. Well, you can sign a petition. You can look what is needed in your neighborhood. There may be a home for asylum seekers who need toys for their children, who need clothes, who need food. There may be immigrants.
What's up, Buttercup? Uh-huh. I'm gonna make some dinner. Okay.
Sorry, please continue.
Young adults need time to learn. They need examples. And starting with things such as signing a petition, I think is a good place to start. And because you asked me, what do I do today? Well, in the 1980s, after I graduated from high school, I led large rallies in my hometown, Passau, against the DVU and NPD, extreme right-wingers. It caused, at the time, it stirred attention throughout Europe at the very least, and it put an end to it. There were no more conventions of right-wingers. In 1992, I remember flying all the way to Oregon, Portland, Oregon, because ballot measure 9 was up for election. It was an extremely harsh measure, anti-gay. Homosexuals were expected to have registration needs, such as pedophiles. I flew there, and I'm very proud to this day that I contributed a little bit that the measure was defeated. It helps if people come out. I was never homosexual, but curbing the rights of people who did not harm anybody, it was unacceptable to me. It taught me over the years that simply lending my voice to gatherings, to events like those, is making a difference. Mostly for me, however, resisting means undoing the forced exclusions from back then. Names, personal names that were deleted from concentration camp memorials, for instance. I found them, I reconstructed them, I brought them back. Numbers of victims that were discounted. Hassa, for instance, listed for a long time, we had only 40 Jews. We cannot have more victims. Well, I dug up almost 400 by name, one by one, because my counting was different. Numbers that were posted on concentration camp memorials were discounted. Well, they forgot this group and that group, and those, well, that were never put there to begin with. I dug up all those forgotten. I reinserted those numbers. I tried to redefine what was a Nazi hero, such as a star bomber dropping bombs on women and children in Guernica. His portrait was hanging in our high school as a hero. Well, it is no longer hanging there. He was a war criminal, not a hero. On the other hand, enemies of the people, such as people who fought in the resistance, priests who spoke up against the discrimination and killing of minorities such as Jews. They were enemies at the time. In real life, they are heroes. They spoke up for others and some were killed, executed because of it. So helping to change the perspective is one of my personal ways to resist general tendencies to forget and to beautify. If it takes threats to silence me, yes, the threats were made. I try to bypass them, to tackle some of them heads on where needed, and to move on undeterred otherwise. Choosing what has first priority and what can wait may play a bigger role, whether you succeed or not, whether you fail early on or whether you can move on, no matter how impeded. So in my case, looking back almost half a century, the ability to persevere accounts for a lot more than temporary horror, terror, and even personal attacks. And they did happen. They were not just verbal threats. So the costs do come if you persevere for a long time. to assess the personal risk and the risk for those you work with is a necessity. It's not just a way of surviving, but it's a smart move to keep going.
We talk a lot within the foundation about civil courage kind of being this muscle that you have to train again and again and again. And it starts in these small ways that you were saying before of signing a petition, of speaking up in a classroom. And it leads to things like you leading a demonstration, you uncovering the truth, giving these names, because part of our thought behind the women of Rosenstrasse and how they're able to go up against armed Nazi guards who are holding their husbands is every day they've been flexing this muscle of civil courage just a little bit by staying with their husbands, by trying to get goods to their husbands' families. All of these tiny things that they're doing that's resisting the regime every day kind of builds this up. And what we'd like to do is have people start to flex these muscles, talk to each other. How can we do these small things? And then it gets bigger. We can organize marches, we can organize these larger movements to make this difference. So I just have one short, or perhaps not short, but one question, then we'll open it to the group. And at least one person's already put some questions in the chat, so we'll get to those as well. You talked about the euthanasia policy and you putting these faces and names to numbers, or if the numbers are even recorded accurately to begin with. There are several religious leaders and eventually family members of people who are murdered. And at this point, they're getting nondescript reasons as to why they've passed away. But eventually these policies are resisted. What mechanisms were in place by the regime to suppress this? And how do you feel that these religious leaders and these family members were able to overcome that and say something? And exhibit that civil courage?
Well, among the measures that were in place was years worth of preventing any protests. Media were not only restricted but manipulated to report from a certain perspective. Other perspectives were suppressed. There were large-scale campaigns run in schools by women in particular, the so-called Reichsfrauenschaft, a women leadership that instructed women in the neighborhood, in every neighborhood, how to deal with it. So that people would not even get upset. Urns were purchased in large amounts. There were always instructions up front to mayors, in particular, mayors of every city, of every town, how to address it to keep the noise level down. There were fake institutions created, registrars who faked the location of death, who faked the time of death, the cause of death. Entire institutions were created to fake all that, mislead, that is, and to conceal. There were threats in place, of course. Should somebody speak out, there was the Gestapo, secret police, and other units who stepped in. They made not only arrests, they made threats. People were put early on, from 33 on, in jail, in prison, in concentration camps. There were executions very early on and highly publicized to intimidate others from speaking up. The fast relocation of killer units and of victims was another measure that was very effective. Paper trails are notoriously slow. So by the time relatives found out where their husbands went to after they were picked up, they were not there anymore. They were deported already. destination unknown was the frequent answer. So there were all kind of measures in place to intimidate and to conceal. Now your question, how did those people manage to resist anyway? For the most part, and I think that goes across the groups of victims, be they Jewish women or parents of a handicapped child or of handicapped mothers, fathers, partners, there was a high personal stake involved. If it was the neighbor's husband who was deported or who vanished simply, well, it may be questionable, maybe he was an alcoholic anyway. Maybe, well, there was some other crime involved. He was always a little shy. He was always a little awkward. So there were stronger reservations. If it was a co-worker whom you barely met in a hallway, empathy was not that big to begin with. Maybe something happened to him. Maybe they relocated, they just moved. However, if an immediate family member was deported, there is plenty of evidence across Germany and Austria, for that matter, that husbands demanded the return of their wives, and usually successfully. It was mothers who were hiding their handicapped children, and police tried to track them down. Teachers tried to track them down. The mothers went out of their way to find a hiding spot. I found even correspondence where a mother of a handicapped child turns to the Nazi Lord Mayor of my hometown, asking for help for the handicapped son. And miracle of miracles, even that fanatic Nazi otherwise was trying to help. He did not write her out. He advised her what might be done. So there are a lot of gray zones where people had to take risks and are still taking risks today. It is very hard to ponder, will you overstep and do more damage than good? Or where you simply are desperate enough, like that mother was in 1943, to save that child, a last-ditch effort. These efforts for family members had a surprising success rate. I have cases from 1933 on, so that is from the month the Nazis took power, where, for example, the co-owner of a Jewish store was arrested. His crime, he was grinning at the Lord Mayor. He had him arrested, put to jail. In that case, it was not the family who requested the release. He was Jewish. His entire staff in the warehouse was not Jewish. The entire staff, all female by the way, signed a written petition to the Nazi Lord Mayor who had arrested him to release him. On the grounds, he is an incredible employer. He is kind. He pays generously. He makes sure they are all right. And sure enough, he was released. He was smart enough, however, to go home from jail, grab his passport, a little cash, and vanish on the spot without waiting for the night. And a few hours later, police came to arrest him again, this time secretly. He was gone. So no matter how courageous the staff acted, and it was bright at the time, it would not have saved his life. If he would not have had a sister in France at the time, where he could have fled to with a passport that he already had, he would not have survived. If he would not have had the money from family members to survive in the underground for years afterwards, he would still not have survived. Usually, the brave act of one person was necessary, be that a wife, be that a parent or a child, or employers, employees, neighbors, a person close to you. It was necessary to initiate a release, but it would never have been enough. The average is counted that it took 7 people to save one person. Not to mention the connections, not to mention the locations, not to mention the money that it took. Without food, you could not survive. Without a location where you could go underground, you could not survive out in the open. So the initial act of resistance, of civil courage of that kind, has always been, as far as I know, in all those research cases, has always been personal. Somebody lost a personal partner. In case of Rosenstraße, it was not just their husbands. When these women lost their husbands for good, their income was gone. The children lost their father and their income. There was a lot at stake. It was a certain measure of despair. If it would have been less desperate, I think a lot less people would have risked that much. And of course, because these actions were concealed, they were not publicized. Other people in other cities were unaware of the success rate that similar measures had in other cities earlier on. It may have encouraged others to try the same, to use the same argument. And of course, the Nazis anticipated that. They prevented the publication of such details. So the courage that all these people showed was independent from one another. The risks that they perceived, be that concentration camp, be that execution, or be that simply jail for themselves, they were serious. They had to calculate the consequences for their family. And the concept of Sippenhaft, that other relatives are held responsible for somebody speaking up, was very serious. It was widely known. So unless there was a desperate situation, most people would not have chosen to risk that much themselves.
I think it brings up a good point of a lot of these rescues happen because someone is close enough to the person that's going to be killed or imprisoned or whatnot. Someone has to care enough to risk themselves and put themselves on the line. Before I end the recording and kind of open it up, we have 3 questions in the chat, but one I really want to get while we're still recording. And one of our participants says, my colleague shows the Nasty Girl film every year in class. What do you want students to know about the film?
Well, foremost, it is just a film, not reality. There are elements that were invented for simply entertainment purposes. The severity of the threats of the whole situation was intentionally concealed. The director wanted to gain an award. For that purpose, the movie had to be very popular. And when I asked the director and said, why did you not show this? Why did you not show that? You knew about it. He said, it would have been too scary. People would not have believed that one person is able to withstand all that additional pressure. So I wrote the book out of Passau as a result of it, because I got so often the question, so what's the difference between the movie and reality? I understood the legitimacy of that question. But honestly, I got tired of retelling the same story. I rather wrote another book instead, a new book instead, not about me, but about other people. So people who want to know the difference, look at my book Out of Passau. It is translated in English. It's available in German. It's online. It's hard copy. Take your pick. The main difference, however, all details that have been altered aside, the movie shows only the beginning. The movie was decided in 1984, not even 4 years into my research. 46 years have passed. So the vast majority, of course, happened afterwards. The real results of my work came afterwards. And when my mother confronted the director, why didn't show anybody that? You know, the real results, the real value of what she did. Just this, you know, this silly beginning. He explained to her, well, everybody has a right to choose. I chose the turning point. What turned this nice, harmless, innocent little high schooler into a civil rights activist? What made this accepted daughter of this established family turn against society? I personally accepted his choice, even if it would not have been my own choice. What my mother, now almost 97, never forgave him is how he portrayed her. You know, this sloppy housewife with rolls in her head and rubber boots in the street and so forth. She was trained a fashion designer. To this day, she is perfectly dressed to the T. Accordingly, I had to look all the time. So for me, none of that matters. Absolutely not at all. Yes, I probably looked better, and so did she. But it has no impact on the story. For me, it's about content. I see, in hindsight, that the movie has worldwide a huge impact that none of us could foretell when Verhoeven decided to make it. It shows a lot of young people in multiple countries on basically every continent ever since that it is possible to find out something on your own. It is possible to speak up to a certain degree. Interesting or fascinating to me is that from beginning on, I was just a girl in Passau, a very local history. No matter where millions and millions of people saw the movie, however, they did not see Passau. They did not even see me. They saw their local community, So in Africa, for instance, it was always perceived as a conflict between black and white. It was seen in other countries, such as Australia, as a conflict between the majority society and the Aborigines. No matter where you look, people in all these countries have always seen their own conflict. That, I think, is a merit the director had, and that I could not even sense until it happened. It is much more important in the long run to have an impact like that than to see how much I personally accomplished in my hometown. Because it's just me, it's just in one city. If this movie could encourage so many people, as I know of in the meantime, people have written PhDs about it. People have written school projects. They started their own research projects. They contacted me asking me, how do I sue my hometown for access? How do I find files about this and that? Without that movie, these people may never have had the idea to get started their own projects. So hundreds of little details aside that the movie changed. Instead of 3 bishops, for instance, you see only one. Content doesn't really differ that much. Aside from multiple differences like that, the movie can be used as a tool. If for no other reason, the movie has been worthwhile. I agreed to it grudgingly because I wasn't sure what he was making of it. I didn't get to see it until it was released publicly. I didn't understand anything about movies either at the time. I learned. But if somebody shows that movie year after year, as this person apparently does, I hope she uses it successfully as a tool. It was never intended to be, but it turned out to be. It holds potential, apparently beyond what we all imagined.
I think that's the greatest hope and the greatest dream of acts of civil courage is it whatever that one act or many acts achieves in and of itself, how does it inspire more? Those are the ends of my questions. I'm sending out a form before anyone leaves, and I'm also going to open it up to questions from our participants. But at this point, I'll stop the recording.